$85, the auctioneer said, and brought the gavel down before anyone could raise a hand against it. Wendell Pruitt laughed when he said it. He always laughed when a bid came in low, like the number itself was the punchline. 60 people stood in the gravel lot behind the old First Farmers Bank in Kestrel, Nebraska, on the 9th of April, 1988, and most of them laughed along with him. That was the way a crowd does. It does not need a reason. It only needs someone loud enough to start it. The man who had made the bid did not laugh. He did not smile, either. He signed a slip, folded it once, and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he walked toward the safe like a man walking toward a job, not a prize. The safe was cast iron, 4 feet high, painted a green that had gone the color of bruise. Rust had eaten a hole the size of a silver dollar near the base. The combination dial was frozen at 31. Nobody else in that lot noticed the dial was frozen exactly there. Ansel Voss noticed. He had spent 50 years reading dials the way other men read faces, and 31, sitting still like that, told him somebody had left at mid-turn, in a hurry, or in trouble. The temperature that morning was 41 degrees, and the wind coming off the wheat stubble carried the smell of last year's diesel and this year's rain. Ansel Voss was 74 years old, 5'9", built narrow through the shoulders the way men get when decades of close work bend them forward instead of out. His hands were the first thing anyone noticed, knuckles swollen with arthritis, 2 fingers on the right hand slightly crooked from an accident with a drill press in 1961. Under his nails, there was always a thin black line of graphite and gun oil, no matter how hard he scrubbed. He wore the same canvas coat he had worn for 11 years. Patched at both elbows, and steel-rimmed glasses that he was always taking off and cleaning on his shirt tail, a habit that meant nothing except that his eyes had gotten tired, and he did not want to admit it yet. He had been a locksmith for 51 years. His father taught him on a Chicago pattern padlock in a shed behind their house in 1937, and told him the only thing worth knowing about locks was that they were not enemies. A lock is not a wall, his father said. It is a conversation. You listen until it tells you what it wants. Ansel had repeated that line to 3 apprentices over the years, and none of them had stayed in the trade. There was no money left in it. Banks used electronic keypads now, and the safes that still had dials were mostly decorative, mostly empty, mostly headed for scrap. He kept doing it anyway, not for the money. The last 3 jobs he'd taken paid less than the gas it cost him a drive there. He did it because a closed thing that nobody else could open still meant something to him, and he had never found a way to explain that to people who did not already understand it. Wendell Pruitt was 6'2" and built like a man who ate well and worked with his mouth more than his hands. He wore a checkered sport coat the color of canned salmon, a gold watch too big for his wrist, and cowboy boots that had never touched a horse. He drove a new Buick Regal maroon and parked it close enough to the auction that everyone had to walk around it. Pruitt ran auctions across 4 counties and made his money on the percentage, not the goods. He liked a big number and a bigger laugh, and Ansel Voss buying a rusted safe for $85 gave him neither, so he made his own entertainment out of it. "Boys, look at this," Pruitt said, loud enough for the back row. "Old Voss here just bought himself a doorstop. $85 for a paperweight that don't even open." A few men laughed, not because it was funny, because Pruitt laughed first, and that was usually enough. Ansel said nothing. He did not answer. He crouched down, put 2 fingers against the cold metal near the hinge, and listened to something none of the rest of them could hear. Now, if you have ever seen a man who knew exactly what he was doing get laughed out of a room by a man who did not, subscribe to this channel. Because the people who stay for stories like Ansel Voss's are exactly who Forgotten Vaults was built for. First Farmers Bank had been built in 1926, brick and limestone, the pride of a town that had 4 grain elevators and a rail spur running straight through the middle of it. It survived the Depression on a thread and closed for good in 1971, when the rail spur was pulled up and the grain business moved 60 miles north to a bigger town with a bigger bank. The safe had belonged to Harlan Meeker, head teller from 1948 until the doors shut. Town records showed Meeker had a nephew, Corporal Denny Meeker, who shipped out to Korea in the fall of 1951. In February of 1952, a telegram came to the bank instead of the house. because Harlan had told the boy to send word there first. His mother's heart was weak, and he wanted to read the news before she did. The telegram said Denny was missing near the Imjin River. Harlan Meeker locked something into that safe on a Tuesday afternoon, spun the dial to 31, and never came back to finish the turn. 3 weeks later, a second telegram came. Denny was confirmed dead. Harlan retired in 1971 with the safe still standing in the back office. And when the bank was stripped and sold, nobody thought to ask him for the combination. He had passed on in 1979, and whatever he put in there had waited 36 years. Ansel Voss knew none of this standing in the gravel lot. But he had lost a brother at Chosin Reservoir in 1950, and something about a dial frozen at 31 made the hair rise on the back of his neck before he understood why. Ansel backed his truck to the loading dock and used the same hand truck he had used for 30 years, wedging a moving blanket under the safe space before he tipped it back onto the wheels. 412 pounds, by his own scale of home, though he only guessed that number from the strain in his lower back going up the ramp. He drove home at 31 miles an hour the whole way, 11 miles of county road, because a load like that shifting wrong could break an ankle before it ever got to the workshop. Word had already reached town before he pulled into his own driveway. Cora Ledbetter at the feed store told her sister on the phone that old Voss had bought Harlan Meeker's safe, and her sister told the woman who cut hair, and by supper time half of Kestrel knew about it and had an opinion. Ansel did not care about any of that. He backed the truck to his garage, ran a chain through the dolly, and walked the safe in himself, 1 inch at a time, sweat cutting through the cold in the unheated bay. He set it under the single bare bulb hanging from a joist, pulled his work stool close, turned off the radio, and laid his tools out on a shop rag in the order he always used them, right to left, smallest to largest, the way his father taught him in 1937. The first attempt told him nothing. The dial would not turn past 31 no matter how gently he coaxed it. He sat back, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked at the thing for a long while without touching it again. He worked penetrating oil into the seam around the door and waited 40 minutes, the cold in the garage settling into his hip the way it always did after 4 o'clock. He thought for the first time in years about quitting. His hands hurt. Nobody wanted this skill anymore. Maybe Pruitt was right, and it really was just a doorstop. The second attempt moved the dial a quarter turn before it caught again. Progress, small as it was. The third attempt was the hard one. A tumbler will bent from age, and Ansel had to work a thin steel feeler behind it by feel alone, eyes closed, listening the way his father taught him to listen, for 40 minutes more. At 9:52 in the evening, the tumblers dropped with a sound no louder than a coin falling on a rug. Not a bang. A small private click, like the safe had been holding its breath as long as Ansel had. Cold air came out first, and with it a smell of old paper, machine oil gone waxy with age, and something underneath that, cedar, maybe, or the ghost of a woman's dusting powder. Ansel did not reach in. He sat on his stool, hands in his lap, and looked into the dark for nearly a full minute before he moved at all. He took the bank items out first, the way he always did, laying each one on the workbench before touching the next. 11 government bonds, matured decades ago and worth, by later count, $9,400. A deed to a quarter section of land nobody in 3 counties had ever thought to claim. A cigar box of Buffalo nickels that a coin dealer in Lincoln would later value at $600. Underneath all of it, wrapped in a handkerchief gone the color of weak tea, was a small tin ring box and a letter, the paper gone soft as cloth. Ansel put on his glasses and read it twice, standing at first, then sitting down slowly on the stool because his knees told him to. The letter was from Harlan Meeker to a young woman named Ruth Callahan, meant to be delivered alongside a ring his nephew Denny had left with him before shipping out, in case the boy did not come home to give it himself. One line stayed with Ansel longer than the rest. The line Harlan had written and never found the courage to send. He wanted her to know the ring waited for her, even if he could not. Ansel folded the letter carefully along its old creases and sat in the cold garage for what felt to him like a long while, though it was 11 minutes by the clock on the wall. He heard the furnace tick on in the house, and somewhere down the road a dog barked twice and stop. He thought of his brother's name on a stone in a cemetery in Iowa, and for a moment his hands would not quite hold still. Then he stood up, turned off the bulb, and went inside to make coffee, because that was what a man did at 10 o'clock at night, whether he had just found a fortune or nothing at all. He drove to the county courthouse the next morning and turned everything over to the clerk, keeping nothing, asking for nothing. He had never been offered a reward and would have been embarrassed by either the offer or the refusal. Ruth Callahan was found 11 days later, 89 years old, living in a care home in Grand Island. She had married once, briefly, and outlived that husband too. When the ring was placed in her hand, she did not speak for a long moment, and then she said only, "I told them he'd send word." She had waited 36 years without knowing there was anything to wait for, and somehow that had not stopped her waiting. Word of it reached Wendell Pruitt inside a week. He told the story a different way at first, claiming he'd always suspected the old safe held something, until enough people in Kestrel had heard the real version that his own version stopped landing. His auction business slid over the following 2 years, quietly, the way businesses do when people simply stop showing up, and in 1991, he sold his gavel and moved out of the county without much notice from anyone. The County Historical Society asked to display the safe, the letter, and a photograph of Ruth and the ring in the old bank lobby, which had been converted into a small museum. Children touch the green paint on the safe door now and ask their parents what it is, and are told a short version of a long story. Ansel Voss went back to work that same week. He is buried now beside his brother in Iowa, but the line he left behind still gets repeated by the two men in that county who still call themselves locksmiths. A lock is not a wall. It is a conversation. Wendell Pruitt got the laugh. Ansel Voss got the truth. Which one would you have wanted, standing in that gravel lot in the cold? And which one do you think you'd actually have earned?